Today's daf is daf Nun Beis, and we'll start with Omer Rabbi Shmuel. Let's just see how we indicate where we're going to start from. I'd have to start counting the lines here. It's approximately, I would say, about 15 lines down from the top of the Omud, and it starts with My Beinayu. So there's a piece of Gemara here on the top, which really belongs to Daf Nun Aleph, the previous daf, and it deals with a question of what's called the Zrika of Dam Ha'olah, and whether it has to be with regard to the Shirayim, right? The Yesod HaMizbeach had two parts. There was the flat part that you saw in front of it, and then there was what's called the Gag HaYesod. And this previous Gemara goes into a discussion about that third pasuk. You may recall from yesterday that it says three times El Yisod Mizbach HaOlah. And the question is what we do with the third time around. And that's the Gemara is trying to decide whether or not the Shvichas Dam of the Shiraim should be what's called Zakuf, Bezkifa, on the flat side of the Yisod, or it should be Al Gag HaYisod. But in any event, right now, the Gemara is going to go back to the main sugya that we discussed yesterday about a Kal V'chomer. And if you recall, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva were quoted in the same brisa, both formulating the Kal V'chomer, but somewhat differently one from the other. So the Gemara now asks, My Beinayu. What's the difference between Rabbi Shmuel's formulation of the Kal V'chomer and Rabbi Akiva? Both of them will basically agree that this Kal V'chomer, which is from Shiorei Chatos, just that Rabbi Akiva adds a few words to the Kal V'chomer, and he says, V'ein boim lechaper, that the kapara of the korban is completed with the Zrikas Adam, and the Shiorei Adam is not part of, nor does it generate the kapara. So what is the difference between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel? Omer Rav Ada Barav, this is the first opinion. I'm going to see Rav Papa disagrees. Shirayim mi akvim ikubenayu. According to Rav Ada Barav, Rabbi Shmuel insists that the kaparas hakarbon is contingent upon the shvichas shirayim. If there was no shvichas shirayim, then the korban is possible. Whereas Mar Sover Lo Me'akve, Rabbi Shmuel's of the opinion, Rabbi Akiva's of the opinion that Lo Ma'akve, that the Shvicha Shirayim is not Ma'akev. And that's what he added in his formulation, Rabbi Akiva of the Kal V'chomer, She'ein Mechaprim V'ein Boim Lechaper, that the Shirayim is not the Mechaper. The Mechaper is the Hazos Adam, and the Shvichas Shirayim is a separate kiyum, a separate mitzvah. However, Rav Papa Amar, the Kuli Alma Shirayim Ein Ma'akvim. According to Rav Papa, even Rabbi Shmuel would agree that Shvichas Shirayim, which is post the Zrika, is not Ma'akev. So you have a Chatos, and you were Makabel Adam and Zorek Adam. Now you have a Chiyuv and a mitzvah to be Shofech Adam. But that is not critical in the efficacy of the Zrikas Adam to generate kapara. V'hacha, so what is then the nafkamina, the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel? B'mitzui chatas ha'of mi'akev kamifligi. So let's understand that in Chatos HaOf, there is a two-stage process, and the second stage in Chatas HaOf, which is called Mitzui, because of the pasuk itself indicates that it's called Mitzui, is parallel to Shvicha Shirayim. So first with the Of, after the Malika, the Dam is then, there's a Hazah in the Mizbeach, and then if there's Dam left in the Of, then the Kohen will then take that oaf and push it against the side of the Mizbeach. And that's kind of like a parallel to Shvichas Shiraim al Yisod in the case of of a Zevach Behem. And according to Rav Papa, Rabbi Yishmael is of the opinion that Mitzui Dam HaChatos, in the case of a Chatos HaOf, is Likuva. It's absolutely critical. Whereas with regard to a chatas behema, according to Rav Papa, everybody, even Rabbi Shmuel, agrees that shvicha shirayim is not ma'akev, but mitzui hadam, according to Rabbi Shmuel, is upgraded to a different status than shvichas shirayim al yisod in the case of a chatas behema. And it would seem at first glance that what Rav Papa is saying, according to Rabbi Shmuel, is that Mitzui Hadam in a Chatas HaOf is part of the Mechaper. It's like an essential, the avoda of the Korban has two parts to it. It's the Hazoya, and then it's the Mitzui Hadam. So the Mitzui Hadam is the clincher of the avodas HaKorban. However, Rabbi Akiva holds that Mitzui Adam in a Chatas HaOf is exactly parallel with the same dinim as Shvicha Shiraim al Gabi Yisod in a Zevach Behema, in a Chatas Behema, and therefore it's not Ma'ak. So now the Gemara is going to quote a brisa to support Rav Papa, meaning that even Rabbi Shmuel would agree, and there's no machlokas, that in the case of a Chatas Behema, the Shvicha Shirayim al Yisod is not Ma'akev. Tanya Kavosi de Rav Papa. Now, what we're going to analyze here is a relationship between two parim. There's the par Kohen Mashiach, that if in event the Kohen Gadol is guilty of a sin, a very severe sin, then he has to bring a par. And part of the avodah of that par is inside the Heichal, where you need Hazoya Keneged HaParoches. And we're going to compare this to the Paro Shel Kohen Gadol B'Yom HaKippurim. And in the case of the Paro Shel Kohen Gadol B'Yom HaKippurim, there, the Avodah Bifnim includes not only the Heichal, but also the Kodesh Kadoshim. And there's going to be Hazoyos in the Kodesh Kadoshim for the Par of Yom Kippur, Keneged HaKapores, meaning in the Kodesh Kadoshim, in the direction of the covering over the Aron of the Aron HaKodesh. So now we're in the parsha of Kohen Moshiach, of Paro Shel Kohen Moshiach. The Kohen Gadol was guilty of a sin, and the Torah in that parsha in Vayikra Daled says, "Veskol dam hapor yishpoch." Now, this kol, the word kol, indicates that all the dam needs shvicha, which means not only the dam that was used for the hazoya, but also the shirayim requires shvicha. That's called shvicha shirayim. So now the Torah is talking about shvicha shirayim in the case of par Mashiach fachet. Now, there's an extra word in the pasuk. If you read it carefully, you could have left out the word hapar, because we're talking about the par. It just could have said veskol hadam yishvach. Why the extra word hapar? Now, let's also point out here, the Gemara doesn't quote the last three words in the pasuk, El Yisod, the last four words, El Yisod Mizbach Ha'olah. So it means that even though the Avodas HaZoyos of the Par Shel Kohen Moshiach will be done in the Heichal, but nevertheless the Shvicha Shirayim is done outside the Heichal on the Yisod of the Mizbach HaOlah, the Mizbach HaChitzoni. Ma Talmud Lomar Apar. Why the extra word Apar? Limed al par Yom Kippurim sheton matan domim liyisod. The Gemara now is going to use an extra word in the pasuk of Par Mashiach as a ribui for the par of the Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim to teach you that the Shvicha Shirayim requirement of the Par Mashiach applies even in the case of the Par Kohen Gadol of Yom Kippurim. So we need that extra word, Hapar Divrei Rebbe. Rabbi Shmuel, I don't need an extra pasuk, Hapar, to teach me Shvicha Shirayim in the case of the Paro Shel Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim, because we can derive that from a Kal V'chomer, because if we compare the par of Kohen Mashiach to the par of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim, there's no doubt in our minds that the par of Yom Kippurim is much more severe. It's much more lechumra, lehachmir. So whatever you require in the case of a par Mashiach should certainly apply to the case of par shel Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim with a Kal V'chomer. Says Rabbi Shmuel, Ma im misha ein nichnas domo lifnim chova. In the case of Par Kohen Moshiach, the requirement of bringing this korban and doing the zrika of the dam of the korban is very contingent. It's not absolute chova. You can't say that the Mashiach, the Kohen Mashiach is chayav in the par of Mashiach. No. It's only an event that he sins, but we're not going to push him to sin. And yet, the Torah requires shvichas shirayim in the case of Par Moshiach, and that's explicit in the parsha. Is therefore, and therefore, misha nichnas domu lifnim chova. Right, in the case of Yom Kippur, every Yom Kippur in and year out is an absolute requirement to bring this par. So it's much more chomer. It's not a mitzvah that sometimes comes to fruition, but it's a yearly requirement. How much more so? Enodin sheton yisod. It would certainly require shvichas damim al yisod. Now we're going to see that Rabbi Akiva has a slightly different Kal V'chomer, because Rabbi Akiva thinks he's one up on Rabbi Shmuel's Kal V'chomer, because Rabbi Akiva believes that his Kal V'chomer is a lot simpler than that of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva, ma im misha ein dama nichnas l'fnai v'lifnim, bein l'chova, bein l'mitzvah, ta'un yisod, misha nichnas dama l'chova l'fnai v'lifnim, ein adin she'ta'un yisod. Rabbi Akiva says, if you want to point out that the par of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim is more chomer than the par of the Kohen Mashiach, then I don't have to stretch my arm out to the question of whether it's a chova or it's not a chova, whether it's contingent upon chait, or it's an absolute unconditional requirement every Yom Kippur. All I have to point out to you is that in the very avoda of the par of Yom Kippurim, we have a chumrah, because the dam of the par of the par of Yom Kippurim goes into the Kodesh Kadoshim, as we said earlier, and there he's going to do the Hazoya Keneged HaKaporos. Whereas in the case of a par Mashiach, his par will go into the Heichal for the purpose of Hazoya Sadam, but there's no entry of the dam into the Kodesh Kadoshim. And if the Torah requires shvichas domim al yisod, shvichas shirayim al yisod, in the case of a par Moshiach, then how much more so in the more chomer dikak par, the par of Yom Kippurim, which is not only is it into the Heichal, but it's lifnai v'lifnim. Now it's interesting, the language of Rebbe Akiva is that when he talks about the Kohen Mashiach, he says bein lechova, bein lemitzvah. Now, what does the word bein lechova mean? I mean, there's no such thing as a chova for the Kohen Mashiach. It's only an event that he sins. So Rashi changes the girsa here and he omits the word bein lechova. But then Rashi makes an effort to try to salvage the girsa as we have it in our Gemaras. And Rashi says that sometimes you can have something where the Chazal will use a terminology to indicate that if you compare it to this way, it comes out to this way. If you compare it to that, it comes out to that. So therefore, if you want to talk about the power of Kohen Mashiach, well, it does have a little bit of a lechova element if you compare it to the Sa'ir Nasi, because the Sa'ir Nasi doesn't go into the Heichal at all. So there's a relativity theory. Relative to the par of Kohen Gadol B'Yom Kippurim, it's certainly, the par shel Kohen Mashiach is certainly not a chova at all. But the reason why the Gemara uses the term according to that girsa lechova is because relative to the sa'ir of the nasi, there is an element of chova, because in event that the Kohen Gadol sins, we will bring the dam hakorban inside the heichal. In any event, moving on, is Misha nichnas dam lechova l'fnai fiminiton shirav yisod. Yochel yakvenu. Now let's understand what the Gemara is going to say now. Since we could derive the requirement of Shvicha Shiraim al Yisod in the case of Par Kohen Gadol B'Yom Kippurim through a Kal V'chomer, why did the Torah have to add the word in the parsha of Kohen Mashiach? Why did the Torah have to add that extra word Par? To tell me that the Par of Yom Kippurim requires Shvichas Yisod, but we already derived that from a Kal V'chomer. So now, Yochel Yakvenu means we're going to apply the principle in Kodshim of Shana Kosev Liakiv, that when the Torah repeats a requirement, it's Likuva. And therefore, Yochel Yakvenu, maybe we're going to say that the power of Kohen Gadol B'Yom Kippurim, in the absence of Shvicha Shiraim al Yisod, will be completely disqualified. Talmud Lomar. And now the Gemara stretches its arm out to a different pasuk in Parshas Achrimos, the parsha of the Avodas Yom Kippurim, and there it says in Vayikra Tezayin, "V'chila mechaper es hakodesh." When the Torah is describing the Seder Avodah from one Avodah to the other on Yom Kippurim, finally, when it comes to the fruition, which is going to be the last of the Zrikos, then it says V'kila mechaper. The mechaper is complete. Sholmu kol kaparas kulam. Now we're not yet up to Shvichas Shiraim al Yisod. In fact, Shvichas Shiraim al Yisod is not mentioned at all in Parshas Achrimos, in the Avodas Yom Kippurim. And therefore, when it's Kila mechaper es hakodesh, it means that the kapara is already complete, with all the avodos culminating in the zrikas hadam, lifnai v'lifnim, and so forth and so on. And that's when the kapara is complete, and the carbon is kosher. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. So Rabbi Shmuel understands, therefore, that in the case of Shvicha Shirayim of the Par Shel Yom Kippurim, it's not Ma'akev. Although, again, if not for this pasuk in Achrei Mos, we would have had a strong hava, meaning that it is Ma'akev, because Shina Kosuv likuva, but we have a pasuk that teaches me that it's not mak. Now we continue in the brisa. Kal v'chomer lepar kohen Mashiach me'ato. In other words, you started your whole process of Kal v'chomer, learning B from A, with the pasuk in Par Mashiach, where Shvichas Shirayim is explicit. Why don't we ask the following question? Why do we need the Torah to teach me that in the case of Par Mashiach, you need Shvichas Shirayim? Why not derive it from soil and Nasi? Nasi brings a soil, and here's going to be the Kal v'chomer. Uma mishenach nichnas damu lifnim lo lechov lo mitzvah. In the case of the soil of the Nasi, there's no bringing of the dam outside of the confines of the Azorah inside the Heichal at all. And yet, the Torah requires Ta'un Yisod. We know that in the Sar Nasi, the Torah says, that was one of the three Pesukim, that you require Shvichas Shirayim al Yisod. Is Misha Nichnas Domu Lefni Bein Lechova Bein LeMitzvah is Eno Din Sheton Yisod. Right, in the case of the Par Kohen Mashiach, where the Torah requires you to take the dam into the Heichal, and that's going to be, again, it's like a chova if we compare it relatively, as we said before, Rashi too, the dam soyer shel nasi is how much more so din sheton yisod. So now we're going to assume that since we derive the requirement of Shvichas Dom al Yisod in the case of Par Mashiach from a Kal v'chomer from Dam Sawyer of a Nasi, therefore when the Torah repeats now in the parsha of Kohen Mashiach, of Par Kohen Mashiach, the requirement of Shvichas Shirayim al Yisod, it must be Likuva. We're going to apply the principle of Shana Lava Kosav Likuva. Yachal Akvenu. Talmud Lomer. Now we need another pasuk, and this pasuk takes us back to Vayikra Zayin, to the parsha of Kohen Mashiach, to Vayikra Dalet. I meant to say Kohen Mashiach, and it says Ves Kol Dam Hapar Yishpo. Now wait a second. At first glance, the Bryce is going in circles here. You're quoting a pasuk which was totally unnecessary. The pasuk explicitly requires Shvichas Dama Yisod in Kohen Mashiach, but we already derived that from a Kal v'chomer from Dam Soyer of a Nasi. But the Gemara says, Nitko hakosuv li ese, vaso shiore mitzvah lo melcha shirayim enim ha'akfa. Now, what does Nitko mean? Nitko literally means like you cut it off, so to speak. Lenatek means when you remove something from where it seems to belong. You take it away. You take it out of its place. So Rashi explains that what's going on over here is the following. The language here of the Torah of Veskol Dam Hapar Yishpoch is very different from all the languages that appear in the Torah with regard to the avodos hakarmon. The Torah always speaks about v'lokach in the imperative, or v'hiza, or v'nosan, right? V'lokach has to do with kabol sadam, and v'hiza has to do with the hazah, and the nosan is the sin al gabi kronos and mizbeach. It's always in the lashon v'nosan. And here it says yishafech. Well, Yishpoch, I should say. It should have said in a language that's more indicative of a requirement. Let me just quickly see if Rashi expands upon this. Oh, it's the last two lines on the page in Rashi. Kol havodos ksiv lokach v'hizav v'nosan al kronos v'kan lo ksiv v'shofach. So there's a difference here grammatically between v'shofach in loshen tzivui and yishpoch. It will be poured. Shina b'mashma'ah. Right, this change seems to indicate the mashmo, a change in the mashmos of the pasuk. L'natko michlal shar avodas lomer she'ein chova kimo oson li kuva. So as opposed to all the avodos where the Torah says, do this, do that, here the Torah says it will be done. And that shiri lashon indicates that it will be done, meaning the shvichas dam al yisod is only lemitzvah, but not liikuv. Frekti Gemara v'sov Rabbi Shmuel mitzui chatas of miyakiv. Now let's go back to square one. We said that according to Rav Papa, even Rabbi Shmuel agrees that shvichas shirayim al yisod in the case of a chatas behema is not likuva. So wherein lies the machlokes between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva? In what case does Rabbi Shmuel say it's likuva? And the answer was mitzui adam. Let's go over this one more time. We're talking about chatas ha'of. And in terms of chatas ha'of, there's a halacha beyond the hazoya that you need, after the hazoya, you need mitzui adam. And Rabbi Shmuel holds that mitzui adam is li'ikuva. And without the mitzui adam, the chatas ha'of will not achieve its goal and will not be a valid korban. Frekta Gemara, is that really so? Can you attribute that shita to Rabbi Shmuel that mitzui chatas adam is, in the case of chatas ha'of la'akev? For Tana debei Rabbi Shmuel, we have a brisa in the name of Rabbi Shmuel with regard to chatas ha'of. Now the parsha of chatas ha'of is in Vayikra Hey, and there it says ve'hanishar badam yimotzei. That's what we call it, mitzui hadam. So hanishar badam, meaning any dam that's left over after the hazoyos hadam, that dam that's left over in the neck of the oaf requires mitzui. And it says vanishar yimotzei. Yimotzei seems to imply that in event that there was still some dam left over, then there's a mitzvah, a chiyuv of mitzui hadam.